Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Alterra Training Podcast, where our goal is to educate and empower you to take control of your health and fitness. We're joined again by Logan Allen with Stronghold Health and Performance. This time we're not doing a debate format. This time we have three topics that, fortunately, they're going to really flow into each other. They're topics that we're both very familiar with. It's definitely influences how we train and definitely forms a lot of our perspective and our training philosophies. So, without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into it. You guys know Logan by now if you've watched the last few episodes. Hopefully you've watched all those. If you haven't, go back and watch them. The debate format ones are really fun. We cover 5 or 6 topics on each one, kind of semi-rapid fire, where we take 5 to 7 or 8 minutes on each topic and just really hit the high points. Really, they're just designed to kind of flesh out the arguments so that you can see both sides of the argument and really make the decision for yourself. So, again, without further ado, the topics that we're going to talk about today are the interference effect with respect to hybrid and concurrent training, and then overtraining, specifically overtraining syndrome, but we're going to flesh all that out, and if we talk more about just training too much, then overtraining syndrome, that's also fine. And then we're going to talk about load management, so training load management, just basically how much volume, intensity, total load you're doing, and how you can optimize that in order to optimize recovery. So, Logan, I'm going to let you give us a little bit of a definition of both hybrid / concurrent training, basically the same, different words for the same thing. And then we'll get into the interference effect a little bit. So go ahead and tell us what hybrid training and concurrent training is.
Okay, so my definition of hybrid training is doing 2 different training modalities that don't necessarily complement one or the other. So a very common example of this is running and some form of lifting. So Nick Bear did a really good job of popularizing the hybrid training style with his bodybuilding and endurance training events. So he'll compete in a bodybuilding show and then run, like he did the Leadville 100-miler. So the 2 polar ends of the spectrum, they don't necessarily complement one another, but they are good for health and longevity. So hybrid training is very popular, especially in that space, of the health and longevity space, because it allows us to do multiple different training goals that have been shown to be beneficial for our overall health, while not focusing on one and then kind of foregoing the benefits of the other. Do you have anything to add to that definition?
No, that's perfect. So I was going to ask you this question, but I'll just go ahead and give the answer that I was kind of going to fish for anyway. This is very different. I don't want to say very different. This is distinct from something like CrossFit, where you're training everything, but you're really training most of the stuff in the middle, so that high-intensity interval training type stuff, you're still using Olympic lifts, other strength gymnastic stuff, so you're still getting a large variety. But your focus in CrossFit is more on the middle of the spectrum, whereas hybrid or concurrent training is, as Logan said, on polar ends. So normally you have some sort of course, endurance event, which is normally running, cycling, triathlon, could be swimming specific, could be any number of longer duration endurance events. Whether or not something like a 1-mile run would be considered an endurance event in this context, I'm not sure. Once I'm done talking, if Logan wants to address that, he can. I don't look at it. So I would not say somebody who has like a 1-mile run specialty and a powerlifting specialty combined. I don't really view that the same way that I would view a longer endurance event, mostly just because there is some overlap between the resistance training and the mile time. So here we're talking about more polar opposites. That's very much up for debate, by the way. That's just my personal opinion. Here talking about polar opposites where the factors have very little impact on each other. So with that being said, Logan, go ahead and add to that if you want to, and then get into the interference effect and kind of what conceptually that is.
Now, I would kind of agree with your mile statement. I think in exercise science there's something called the force velocity curve. And it kind of goes to show that when you improve force, it raises the curve, which will help you improve your velocity. It's not a direct, like 1-to-1, you double your squat, you're going to double your speed. But it does have some sort of influence. So weightlifting does have a better carryover to faster events. So improving your squat would definitely help your 100-meter sprint more than it would an ultra marathon. That being said, I still think ultra marathoners should squat, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. The hybrid training is the polar opposites of the spectrum. So I would agree. I don't know where that line, I don't know where I draw the line, but I do think that these shorter distance events in weightlifting are not polar opposites. They do have a little bit more crossover than I think a lot of people realize. So that's enough of that soapbox. I'll get into the interference effect. So the interference effect is kind of defined as one modality blunting the response of another modality. So a lot of people, if you think about classic gym bros, they're afraid of doing cardio because they're afraid of losing their gains. And that really sums up the interference effect. Is we don't want to do one modality because it's going to prevent us from adapting to the other modality, and then we're just going to waste a whole bunch of time. That's really shown to be dramatically overhyped. The interference effect is much smaller than we originally thought. It does exist, but it's not, in my opinion, it's not really something to concern yourself about unless you're maybe a professional athlete in whatever scenario. I'll hand it to you, and I have a little bit more to say, but I don't want to go too crazy with it.
Recapping what Logan said, he made the great example of how oftentimes people who are trying to gain muscle just avoid cardio because it's going to help keep their total net calories down for the day when they want to keep their calories up. But moreover, they think that the cardio is actually going to directly inhibit their gains. So there is some scientific backing from this. Basically, you have AMPK, AMP kinase. It's basically an energy sensor that cells use to communicate with each other. Basically, the more adenosine triphosphate down to diphosphate down to monophosphate is used, more AMPK is activated. And this is starts a cascade of cellular signaling that does actually interfere with the hypertrophy pathway of mTOR. So there is some scientific backing for this. However, I don't want to kind of jump to the conclusion, but we will see that the mechanism and then the kind of biochemistry, even gene expression stuff, while it's real and while we can actually measure it, it does not really seem to come through as a big issue in actual human outcome data.
I was just about to write that down. A little point I want to highlight is mechanisms versus outcomes. We see a lot of people get really hung up on mechanistic data, but our bodies are insanely complex. Like Trace is saying, we're just kind of gliding over the surface, talking about mTOR, AMPK. There's so many more signaling pathways, so many pathways along that cascade. It's not just those two chemicals. But we can get really focused on that single mechanism and we go, okay, so because this affects this has to be true. But our bodies are extremely complex, like I said. There's a whole bunch of redundancies that just because there is a mechanism doesn't mean that there's an outcome. And I think in general, a lot of people should focus more on outcome data because that's actually what's going to affect us. And while the mechanistic data does have a place, it does show us that we may need to look more into that, or maybe it's the reason why an outcome occurs. Or maybe it'll just tell us, hey, we need to research this more and see if there is an outcome. We shouldn't put all our eggs in that mechanistic basket. So, yeah, the key takeaway of that is just because there is a mechanism doesn't mean we should concern ourselves about it.
Yeah, and the way I see a lot of this stuff, when you look at the research on fatigue, whether it's acute fatigue or long-term fatigue, whether it's in a muscular endurance or an ultra-marathon type thing, whatever you're measuring is what you're going to focus on. And as Logan said, the body is so complex. I'm so entertained by people, generally medical doctors, other researchers as well, who think that we really have a good understanding of our anatomy and physiology. Yeah, we have a decent understanding of anatomy, but we have so much to learn about physiology that what Logan's point is about mechanism. If we're focused on the mechanism, we're too deep in the trenches to actually make practical, real life changes. Personally, though, I do love the mechanism. I love physiology. I'm a physiology nerd. However, when it comes to actually the way that I'm going to coach people, coach you, I'm only going to kind of use that as some backup support to the human outcome data and to the actual observable effects that we can produce. So a lot of this stuff, we're looking at like gene expression. We're looking at, a lot of biochemical pathways, energy system type stuff. All this stuff, again, is very, very real, and again, I'm super interested in it. But if it doesn't actually improve the athlete, then if it doesn't really actually affect the athlete, then I'm only going to give so much respect to that data in terms of how I'm going to actually use it. So we talked about how endurance training, so cardiovascular training, may inhibit some of the muscular gain side. Logan, tell me a little bit of your experience with the opposite side, where endurance athletes maybe don't want to strength train.
Yeah, so that's another area we see, is that a lot of endurance athletes want to stay relatively small and lean. Because if you think about it, carrying, let's say 100 pounds, just to make it simple, for a marathon is a lot easier than carrying even like 120 pounds. So every pound makes a big difference when you are carrying the weight of your body over the course of like 26.2 miles in the marathon example. So because of that, a lot of endurance athletes prioritize endurance and they don't prioritize strength or hypertrophy because, once again, they don't want to gain any muscle. However, the fallacy that surrounds that, I guess it's not really a fallacy. The problem with that, though, is that a lot of muscular strength and hypertrophy will help reduce the severity or the risk of overtraining injuries or overuse injuries. I had another point there and I completely just lost it. I'll let you carry it and then I'll hopefully remember what I was going to say.
Yeah, so for resistance training, that's a broad category. That could be strength training, power training, muscular endurance, muscular hypertrophy. The big thing with this population, these individuals, because as Logan said, if you're carrying more weight, if you add that up over a long duration, it really does make a difference. I mean, I know personally, I'm 190-ish pounds at my ultramarathon weight, and that is really heavy. I don't know percentage-wise, I am definitely one of the, probably every race I'm one of the top 10 or 15 heaviest athletes out there. And trust me, I feel it, especially on the uphills. Downhills, I'm strong enough and I have enough fitness to where I can coast the downhills, but still the speed of the downhills is, because I can't just let myself go like a lot of these 140, 150 pound athletes, it is harder. It's pretty much just a fact. I mean, there's really no way around that. If you're operating with your heart, with your lungs, that stuff doesn't really grow a lot. Yes, your heart can adapt. There are some adaptations to your lungs, capillarization as well. However, when we're talking about like your main engine being your heart and your lungs, that's really what's producing. That's a big limiting factor. Maybe it's not your engine, but it's a huge limiting factor. If you have those same organs for a 190 pound person versus a 140 pound person, even if I get a 20% adaptation from baseline, even if I'm training really hard, it's still working relatively way harder than a lighter athlete. So kind of the way around this, if we're not looking at it from the concurrent training perspective, but if we're actually looking at it from the strength and conditioning perspective for endurance athletes, is to do some really high threshold strength, yes, but also some power. So plyometrics, other power and rate of force development exercises. I'm also not afraid to put somebody under a barbell and like do even just box squats, so you don't have to do 4 range of motion squats. Yeah, that is going to add to your total training load, which we'll get to later. But even just something like box squats where they're just, even in like a quarter squat, but they're loaded up with 120, 150% of their body weight, and they're able to really own that weight. So don't mistake all resistance training with hypertrophy training. There's tons of benefits to be had even in the absence of hypertrophy.
No, I completely agree. I think that is a common misconception that people assume they go to the gym, they lift weights, the only adaptation they're going to get is muscle size. They're going to immediately turn into a bodybuilder. We can get plenty strong without putting on really any muscle mass. We can make metabolic changes to the muscle. We can influence our neuromuscular system to the point where we are getting very, very strong and not gaining weight. We see this time and time again in like the Olympics. We're constantly setting new records at lighter body weights. It's really phenomenal. So, that being said, like Trace was kind of alluding to, most endurance athletes would probably benefit from training strength and power, or strength or power, depending on the sport and their individual needs, rather than hypertrophy. So, I don't think they should train like a bodybuilder, but I do think that getting in the gym would be beneficial for them. That being said, there's a rule that Andy Galpin kind of popularized called the 3-to-5 rule, which I think is a really simple, easy way for endurance athletes to think about going to the gym. And essentially the 3-to-5 rule is you're going to pick a number 3 to 5 for every variable you can think of. So 3 to 5 days a week, you're going to do 3 to 5 exercises. You're going to do 3 to 5 sets of each exercise. You can do 3 to 5 reps per exercise and take like 3 to 5 minutes of rest in between each exercise. So 3 to 5 every variable. That way we're really staying in that strength category and not the hypertrophy, because really we start to see more hypertrophic effects above 5 reps, really anywhere from like 5 to 30. So if we're staying below that, keeping the weight really high, we're going to get plenty strong without gaining much size, which will be beneficial to runners, cyclists, anything where you're carrying your body weight for an extended period of time.
Yeah, and there's plenty of evidence to show that stronger athletes and more powerful athletes are also better endurance athletes. At least up to, I was actually talking with Dr. Killian, he's both of our, a mentor of both of us, and he said he was referencing a study up to half a marathon. You can see direct benefits from sprint work, which is plyometrics, which would basically arguably fit into this power development. Yeah, it's a little stretch, it's a couple small leaps of faith there, but the premise makes sense to where a more powerful athlete is going to be able to produce a higher relative percent of power for a long duration, in this case up to half a marathon. But that is not saying that there's no benefit to being stronger or more powerful at longer durations as well. That's just the what the researchers chose to measure and what they could find statistically significant results at. So interference effects still, let's kind of get back away from the endurance athlete and even away from the strength athlete and think about individuals who are very much in the middle, who do have that strength of pursuit and endurance. I'm going to give rough numbers here. Let's say that we're talking to or about individuals who are roughly a 70-30 split or less. I don't know how to phrase that. 70-30% or 60-40 or 50-50 split on strength on strength and power and endurance. So for me, I consider myself probably a 60 to 65% strength athlete, and then 35 to 40% endurance athlete. So there's some people might be 50-50, some people might be 70-30. We're going to all categorize all these individuals into concurrent athletes or hybrid athletes for now, because we obviously can't address every single athlete. So what this looks like in my mind, what that means is about 60% of my training time and training energy goes into resistance training, whereas about 40% goes into endurance training. That is also changes different times of the year. So if I'm preparing for an ultramarathon, then I'm really a 60, maybe even a 70-30 endurance athlete for the month before that or whatever. So what would training look like? Let's put it this way, what are some training tips that you would have for individuals who fall into this category in terms of when to train, how to train. You can even get into a little bit of nutritional stuff and other recovery if you want to.
Okay, so depending on your percentage split between endurance to resistance training, whatever you prioritize the most, I would probably do that first in the week or in the day. So if you are doing like a 2-a-day and you prioritize resistance training, I would do the resistance training first and then run. Or if you prioritize running, I would do running first and then resistance training. So that way we can devote the most amount of energy and the most amount of intentional effort to whatever exercise modality we prefer or we're trying to improve the most. So for me, for example, during the summer months, I train more like resistance training, more strength, and a little bit less. So I'm probably like 70-30 with the resistance training being the 70. Whereas in the winter, I kind of flip and do a little bit more endurance training. So it's like 70% endurance training, 30% resistance. So depending on what my priority is, I do that first if for whatever reason I am doing a 2-a-day. If we are still concerned about the interference effect, that would be somewhere we could do a 2-a-day as well, because the more time apart we have in between resistance and endurance exercise, the less interference there's going to be. So, for example, you could work out in the morning and then go for a run after work or once you get home. If you are concerned about the interference effect, if you don't have that much time, once again, the interference effect is much smaller than most people originally thought. So there's nothing wrong with working out for 45 minutes and like going for a little run directly after that, or vice versa, going for a run and then doing your lift after that. It would be better if you are trying to optimize to do it separate, but that's the key, is optimization versus realistic, what you have time for.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone has a plethora of time. Most of the time time is the limiting factor. So while optimization is great, we need to be realistic as well. So take a step back, look at what do we have time for, make a program that is appropriate and not something that you're going to quit 3 weeks in just because you don't have time, you're neglecting other areas of life. Because while we both are really biased towards the benefits of exercise, there are plenty other aspects of health, nutrition, sleep, social life, like that all play into our holistic well-being. And if we are really focused on optimizing our exercise program, we're doing 2-a-days, we don't have time to hang out with friends, we're not getting good sleep, we don't have time to cook, we're eating really bad, it's probably going to do more harm than good. So in that scenario, it's just going to be a personal thing of what do I have time for, what can I do, would it be better for me to do like before and after work, would it be better just to do both before, both after, and just, yeah, that's going to be a personal preference, personal thing. But once again, whatever you prioritize, do that first. Yeah, I think I'll call it there. I'll let you.
Yeah, so at what point do you think individuals should be considering 2-a-days versus just 1-a-days? So how many total training sessions per week should these individuals have? So if you're suggesting that somebody does a 2-a-day, then you're not inherently but somewhat implying that they should be training between resistance training and endurance training over 7 days a week. Because the way I see it, there would be no real physiological benefit to training twice a day if you're not taking a bunch of rest days. So basically, training load. So I know that we both have and we both do still train twice a day on some days, but is that actually better? At what point, what fitness level, kind of arbitrarily, do you think people need to consider training twice a day instead of just training one good session every day or 5 or 6 days a week?
That's a good point. I was probably getting ahead of myself a little bit there. I would probably recommend 2-a-days for more advanced athletes, maybe if you're training for something very specific. So if you're running a marathon and you really need to get your training dialed in, for a recreational athlete, someone that's maybe not training for anything specific, I probably would not recommend 2-a-days. I think that you can do plenty, even, do like 3 resistance training and maybe 3 cardio days. That's 6 days a week, which is a lot for a lot of people, but you still have that 1 day of rest. You could do, you could even do 2 and 2. You could do 2 like full body workouts for the resistance training and 2 cardio days. So you definitely, 2-a-days is not necessary, it's not essential, but it can be depending on what event you're training for and how specific / optimized you want to be. If you are just training for a marathon or an ultra marathon or some sort of event, but you're not trying to compete, you're not trying to do really well, you just want to check it off, just finish, you probably don't need to do 2 days either. But once again, it boils down to how optimized do you want the training to be, how specific it needs to be, and also how well you want to do. But for most people, once again, 2 days, not essential. You could get by with probably even just 4 days a week, 2 resistance, 2 cardio. And for the vast majority of people, I think that'd be great.
So for individuals who are about our fitness level or fitter, and this is an opinion-based question, my opinion switches quite often based on the way that I feel. There's so many factors here, whether it be family, job, other pursuits, whatever it may be. Would you be more in favor of maybe doing 10 total training sessions a week, but having a few days be 2-a-days and then have 1 or 2 full days off? Or would you rather have an even distribution? So would you rather kind of provide a big insult to the body with both strength and endurance on one day and then have a full day of recovery? Or would you rather do a strength workout on Monday and then an endurance workout on Tuesday, where you have different stimuli, of course, but you don't have that full 24, 48 hours of full, complete rest? Does that make sense?
It does. I think this is really a personal preference. So personally, I probably prefer to do a little bit shorter sessions, but do 2-a-days and get the same net stimulus over the week rather than doing lesser, longer events. So if you're training for an ultra marathon, one of the most important things is weekly mileage. So I could break that up. Say if I'm trying to get 50 miles a week, I could do a 20-mile run, which will probably take 3 or 4 hours, followed by a few different short runs. Or I could just do 5 10-mile runs. So that's still a lot, but it'd be shorter per day, but essentially doing lesser distance, but still getting the same total distance. That being said, I still like to do a long run. I think if you are training for a really long endurance run, you want to have time. I guess I was going to say time under tension, but that's not the right...
Time under stress.
Yeah, time under stress, where you are preparing yourself for that amount of load and mileage. But for most part, if I'm not training for something, I prefer to do more frequent, shorter sessions than longer, more intense sessions. I find that I personally can recover a little bit better from a whole bunch of short sessions and still get the same net stimulus rather than just a huge insult to the body and crushing my body, then taking a few days to recover. But what's your preference?
For my own individual training, I often find it's better to do 2-a-days, have basically a hard day and then an easy day, hard day, then easy day. That's not always 2 workouts on Monday and then totally off Tuesday, 2 workouts Wednesday, totally off Thursday. But I do find, so perfect example, Monday, so 2 days ago, I did a really, really big leg workout and then just did a 4-mile run on Candler's Mountain, which is the mountain here at Liberty University. Not super tough terrain, but tough enough to where it's, you do stop to walk on the steep uphills and stuff sometimes. And for where I'm currently at training-wise for endurance, 4 miles is kind of a perfect amount to where it's by no means fatiguing, but it is enough to provide a stimulus, especially when stacked on top of a solid hour and a half leg training session before that. But then Tuesday, I basically just didn't do anything. I did some upper body weight exercises, but then tonight, so today's Wednesday, I'll do another run and then a lifting session, time permitted. So this is very much, as I kind of stated before I even gave Logan the question, it's very much dependent on everything else you have going on in life. So over summer, I can do 2 days every day, maybe take off Sunday. Now that's not 2 hard training sessions every day, but it's normally a lift and some form of cardio, whether it's a jog or I actually am very biased toward the ski ergometer and the row ergometer. I think they have tons of value in the cross-training realm, which we can actually address, and I might give that question to Logan after this. But all that to say, the total weekly volume, even if I'm actually training, 10, 12, sometimes 14 times a week, my endurance training, my cardiovascular training, generally is only in doses of 20 to 30 minutes, and it's normally low intensity. So it's high frequency, low intensity. That's what I find works best for me. Yes, I'm an ultramarathon runner, so is Logan, so are a bunch of our friends. So we do understand the value of that long run. However, we also understand how impactful that long run is to the rest of your training. A true long run, we just do them Saturday mornings most of the time is when we do them. Oftentimes we'll go out as a big group. That long run on Saturday is still going to affect you whether or not you know it. Definitely until Monday, maybe even till Tuesday. And then I don't want to get too far ahead of where we're going. But you don't really, regardless of what people say, I take it from me, take it from anybody else, take it from somebody. You're not actually fully recovered from a true hard long run for, I would suspect, at least a week, if not more. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't train. It doesn't mean you can't benefit from exercise. But if you're looking at, I don't want to get too far in the weeds in this, but endocrine markers, other blood markers, muscle damage, force output, power output, this stuff, on the whole, takes a long time to recover from. So, as Logan and I both alluded to, kind of in the off-season of ultra running, we still do our cardio, but it's normally in smaller doses. At least for me, it's more frequent. And then, so I do want to address the total weekly mileage. That's a big thing in the endurance community. People love to brag about how many miles they got in a week. Could be a whole conversation for another time. But for this today, I do want to kind of put my 2 cents in, which is high weekly mileage is only beneficial if you're actually benefiting from it. So just because you ran 60 miles last week doesn't mean you benefited from 60 miles last week. You probably could have gotten the same benefit with less fatigue, less damage, less time for 40 miles. Same intensity on average. But most people just simply, especially in the concurrent training realm where we're doing lifting as well, and especially people who are not really high-level athletes, I assure you, you are not benefiting from every mile the way that you think you are, especially if you're over 40, 50 miles. And I'm even talking to our friends who are good ultra runners that, I don't want to say obsess over mileage, but mileage is that key. I feel very strongly, with good evidence as well, that oftentimes people are doing much more than they need. So Logan, I'll get off my soapbox and let you address those points.
Oh, I completely agree. I think that especially knowing what we know now about like lactate and lactate metabolism, they would probably benefit more from probably doing a little bit more speed work. Not speed work in terms of maybe something a track athlete would do, but speed work for an ultramarathoner, which might be anywhere from like mile to like 5K repeats. So not like true speed, and keeping the mileage less, but having a little bit higher intensity, because you like a lot of our friends will get 80 to 100 miles a week, and that's just often too much to recover from. They can't keep that up for very long. So it really boils down to like the stimulus to fatigue ratio. We want to, and this doesn't just go for endurance training, it goes to weight training, it goes to everything. We want to maximize the stimulus while minimizing the fatigue. So if we can get a huge stimulus for whatever we're trying to get, whether it's endurance, resistance training, whatever, and we can kind of leave that workout feeling great, that's a win. That's why a lot of bodybuilders, for example, probably skip out in deadlifts, because deadlifts have a huge fatigue ratio, and they don't necessarily do a lot for hypertrophy, which is what bodybuilders are trying to go for. So that's a very specific, very niche example. But the same thing goes for endurance training, where if we're just getting a ton of mileage and we're generating a ton of fatigue, but we're not really getting any specific stimulus, then what's the point? There are some specific examples when you're training for a very long endurance run where you might want to do back-to-back long runs.
There are certainly benefits to that, yeah.
Yeah.
All this stuff can be caveated. But my main premise here is people pursue mileage for mileage's sake.
Yeah, and I would agree with Trace and say like that's not the way we should go. Just because you can run 80 miles a week doesn't mean that we should. Because realistically, we want to be in the sport for a long time. And if we burn out, we get an injury just because we're chasing mileage, I mean, what's the point?
I mean, I'm not going to name names, but we both have, there's two friends that come to mind that are very good ultra runners that jumped right into the sport, did really well. They still do well, but they have both kind of gone through periods of basically non-functional overreaching for a long period of time, and they are losing / have lost kind of that love and that vigor, that drive for the sport. And in my opinion, that's very much because they're actually so fit that they were able to train themselves into a detrimental state. So insane athletes, I mean, run literally almost twice as fast as I do on the trails. But because they're so fit, they've trained so hard and accumulated so much volume and mentally been so strong and pushed through that they have now admitted kind of to their mistakes of training too hard, too much. Another big one is racing too much as well. So we kind of talked about how total mileage probably is too high for a lot of individuals. Do not take that to think that Logan and I don't see the value in that higher volume, low intensity training. We certainly see value in that like zone 1, zone 2 pace threshold. Actually, let's address that. So most elite endurance athletes train in this 80-20-ish split, where about 80% of their total volume is considered low intensity, which would be zone 1 and zone 2. So the highest threshold basically of zone 2 is right before your lactate threshold. So this is a very comfortable pace. It's not necessarily an easy pace. Like, you do still have to put forth effort to get to this pace. But you can breathe just fine here. By definition, your lactate is, I believe, below 4 millimoles in your blood. Generally, this correlates to about 75% of your max heart rate. These are rough numbers. But, so 80-20% split for low intensity to high intensity. High intensity being basically anything at lactate threshold or above. So it could be kind of that 20-minute hard pace where you can sustain it, but it's really uncomfortable, to the classic Norwegian 4x4 VO2 max booster protocol, basically, to high intensity interval training. So that's the 80-20 split. Most competitive endurance athletes do have that split on average throughout the whole year. So Logan, first of all, do you agree with that concept, what I just said? And do you think that should remain true. That 80-20 split should be carried over to hybrid athletes and concurrent athletes as well.
I think if you're actually doing the 80-20 split, it can be great. In the scenario of where people are getting 80, 90 miles a week, it's going to be like a 95-5 interval or split. Because realistically, if you're doing that many miles, you don't have much energy left for that higher intensity, the 20% per se. So that 20% drops back down to maybe 5 to 10%. I think there is a really big benefit to doing like the 80-20. I think a lot of athletes do see a really big success with that ratio. One of the caveats to that is that a lot of times they're not doing the zone 2, only that one modality. So Trace kind of alluded to this earlier with the cross training. This is somewhere where like a row erg or ski erg can be a great like tool, or even a bike.
Biking, assault bike, even swimming technically.
Yeah. So if you're a runner, you can still run a lot, and there is like the SAID principle does so. Like if we run, we're gonna get better at running. It's the most specific adaptation to that demand. But that being said, there is a large benefit to doing some of that zone 2 training in a different modality, so that way we're not kind of pushing to the point where we're really getting overuse injuries. So if you're a runner, you could bike. If you're a biker, you could run, you could swim. Really any modality that's different than the modality you typically do. And this doesn't have to be the full 80% of that zone 2. You can still do maybe 70% and then only 10. I was thinking 70%, 30%. I was breaking up the 80 into another. You can do like 50% zone 2, whatever modality you like, and then the 30% cross training, and then 20% higher intensity.
The 20% being the high intensity.
Yeah.
And that is where you do want it to be modality specific from all the literature that I've seen. So that zone 2, zone 1, zone 2, it does seem like you can get some good crossover benefit, holistic systemic benefit from doing like rowing or cycling, ski erg. Ski erg probably a little bit less so than the other two. So you can get those kind of systemic cardiovascular, even energy system benefits. But really, when we're talking about sport specificity, you do want your higher intensity stuff to be sport specific. So as Logan's alluding to, accumulating low intensity volume through different modalities I think is great. It prevents overuse injuries theoretically. It provides fun. Like I just enjoy hopping on the rower. I have this workout where I go, well I have a few different workouts. I'll just jump from the rower to the ski erg to the assault bike and just do like 10 minutes on each just at a steady state. And that is just the easiest, but also, so it's the simplest and mentally easiest way for me to accumulate 30 minutes of like right at zone 2 training volume. 10-minute intervals, you literally just go one to the other. You're hardly out of breath. You can still somewhat carry on the conversation. But you are, and Logan alluded to this, you're training the mitochondria of other muscles besides those that are specific to your sport. So you're getting the arms and the back and the shoulders and to some extent the pecs, spinal erectors. You're getting all these involved and you're actually training them. And this is probably a little, well, depending on what your understanding of lactate metabolism is, this is probably not real world practical, as we were talking about earlier, mechanism versus real world outcomes. But one of the things that I think about is if I can develop more mitochondria throughout the rest of my body besides my legs, then theoretically I'll be able to metabolize lactate and quote unquote clear lactate faster. So the lactate that's produced in my legs while running will theoretically have kind of a place to go and get metabolized that will not have to be metabolized in the liver elsewhere. So this kind of whole body training and that low to moderate intensity, depending on your definitions, can be really beneficial. Yes, for cardiovascular, systemic, even just like burning calories, but also there's definitely some strong biochemical and other physiologic defenses for doing this. But again, your hard training, this is kind of a bold statement, but I would say you're probably wasting your energy and recovery energy if you're trying to be like an ultra runner or a marathon runner or even half marathon runner, if you're doing your intervals on like a bike or a rower or a ski erg. Not bad, you're still going to get some benefit, but it's unless you're like kind of fighting off an injury or trying to prevent overuse injury, it's really, really going to be worth doing your higher, harder stuff with your modality that you're actually trying to improve.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like Trace kind of said, most of that like low intensity at 80% should be conversation pace. So you should be able to hold a conversation, but it shouldn't necessarily be a super easy conversation either. So if you're talking kind of like Trace and I are talking right now, you could probably pick up the intensity a little bit, but not to the point where you can no longer hold a conversation. The other thing that Trace also kind of alluded to is for that higher intensity or for like that long run, we do want that to be in your specific modality because there is a large tissue tolerance component. So if we don't train running at all, and all of a sudden we go out to run an ultra marathon, even though we probably have a large cardiovascular base, all of our connective tissue, the ligaments and tendons, and the fascia surrounding what we need to like use to move and run, may not be as strong or as adapted as it could be. So that's why it is still important to do at least some of your training in that modality specific like way, rather than doing all of your training in just various other modalities. Even though, once again, your cardiovascular endurance will be better and you probably could sustain that for a very long period of time, the tissue tolerance.
Like the weakest link is going to be the one that breaks.
Yes, yep. I also wanted to tie back the conversation to lactate a little bit in terms of resistance training. One of the areas in which cardiovascular training benefits resistance training is if we do train cardiovascularly at a high intensity, we're going to have a large amount of lactate that is produced, and lactate stimulates mitochondrial like biogenesis. So what that means is that when we go at a high intensity, we're going to stimulate more mitochondria to be produced, which means we're going to be able to have a higher capacity for clearing lactate in the future, which means that when we're resistance training, we're going to be able to recover at a rapid or more rapid pace than if our cardiovascular endurance was subpar. So I know we talked about this in the very beginning. Even though these are two polar opposite modalities, and there's not very much carryover, there's a little bit of carryover because if we can recover better, because we're doing cardio, our resistance training is going to improve as well. Yeah, I think that's all I had there, actually.
So, how many days a week, how many training sessions per week do you think is reasonable for people about our fitness level? Whether if in concurrent training. So like, well, I'll just ask you, how many times a week do you train, and what's kind of your split? I'll go first so that you just understand. So pretty much, as I alluded to, and as you guys all know, there's a lot of other factors that come into play besides just your training program. Obviously, work, family life, other pursuits are all very, very big here. I think probably they play a bigger role than a lot of people would acknowledge. So me personally, I generally do 2 hard leg days and 2 hard upper body days and then an easy upper body day. So I normally lift 5 days a week, and I normally do 2 to 3, normally 3 on average runs per week, and oftentimes because I'm a power lifter basically and an ultra runner, I really don't do a lot of higher intensity stuff year round. As we get closer to races, I will do some like mile repeats just to kind of increase that lactate threshold, kind of to top some things off. This is all into different training philosophies, and different people need different things. But because my leg days are, I don't want to say so intense, I don't want to sound like I'm just a beast in the gym, but because of the high total load, the compound exercises, doing strength, power, some muscular endurance, some hypertrophy stuff, I am getting a lot of volume in my legs. And this is very much a conversation for another time, but bioenergetics, even lifting, even though we kind of classify lifting as anaerobic, even as Logan alluded to, there's still a very considerable aerobic portion to lifting, especially kind of the higher volume lifting that occurs. So I kind of use that as kind of supplemental aerobic training. So a lot of times I'll do like compound giant sets where I'll do like box jumps into squats into like hanging knee tucks or leg tucks or whatever. So not like super high intensity, not super high volume, but it is enough to stimulate some of the cardiovascular adaptations that I'm looking for. Now that is not my main goal behind lifting, of course, but I do kind of factor that into my running. So when I do get my 2 solid lower body days, 2 solid upper body days, and then a supplemental resistance training, then I really feel that I can get away with 2 to 3 runs per week. But as we get closer to races, I don't want to say totally flip that. I normally do 2 leg days a week, but these are normally very low volume, very high intensity. So it's literally going to be like 3 sets of 3, or at most 5 sets of 5 back squats. And that'll be seriously my whole leg day. Maybe I'll do some kettlebell swings and some box jumps, but I'm trading that for much higher volume in the running and some higher intensity stuff while running. So my average weekly mileage, I don't know, I can look on Strava right now. I suspect for over half the year, my actual mileage is probably only about 10 miles per week. And then probably about 2 months before a race, I'll switch that and I'll get up to, for me, I found about 30 miles a week is just fine. I'm going to try to get a little bit higher, try to get fit enough to need to get a little bit higher for Promised Land, which is in April, which is in, 6 months. So I'm going to try to take that race a little bit more seriously and try to get lose some weight and get a little bit more cardiovascularly fit. But all that to say, certain attributes do have some degree, or certain training modalities do have some degree of carryover to others. So we can see this in the CrossFit world. Again, I have a high degree of respect for these athletes. A lot of them have a pretty respectable VO2 max, even though they don't do a lot of traditional endurance training. And that's because aerobic metabolism is active during any type of exercise that you're doing. Now, again, we'll get into specifics of what that can mean in a later podcast, but just because you're doing a quote-unquote anaerobic workout, like 100-meter repeats, does not mean that your aerobic system is not taxed and is therefore going to adapt. So that's just kind of my philosophy, how different attributes, different training styles can affect each other. So my lifting, generally higher intensity, somewhat higher volume, whereas my running, pretty low volume, but my running, at least during the off-season, is always very specific to my sport. So it's almost like sport practice. Basically, all of my runs during the quote-unquote off-season are just easy runs on trails. So I'm still keeping a lot of that sport specificity. That was a long-winded answer. Logan, what's kind of your split and what's your philosophy based on what I just said?
Yeah, so that's currently I'm prioritizing lifting. So I'm trying to get really focusing on strength adaptations currently. So I'm only running, honestly, about the same as Trace, about 10 miles a week. So running volume, at least comparatively to most ultra endurance athletes, but we were talking about earlier, like 70, 80, 90 miles a week. 10 is much less. It's enough for us to maintain currently.
Yep.
And make sure our baseline doesn't drop far enough so that when we do start to train for Promised Land, we're not starting from ground one or ground zero. Ground one. I don't know where that came from. Anyways, Square one. That I'm combining two different sayings. Anyways, so the goal for the off season really is just to maintain, not necessarily gain currently, because once again, endurance training isn't our main focus currently. Once again, Promised Land though is in 6 months. I'll probably start training probably about 4 months ahead of that, adding mileage, maybe going like 30, 50 miles a week, doing plenty of speed work. Once again, speed work in the context of ultra running. Mm-hmm. Probably mile repeats.
That's a hot debate in our strength and conditioning friend group. Speed work means something very different for endurance athletes and team sport athletes.
Yeah. It's going to be more like repeated sprint effort and sprint I use very loosely. It is not a repeated sprint effort in terms of a soccer athlete or a track athlete that might be doing actual sprints. This is repeated fast jog efforts. Mile, 5K, a little bit of a breather.
Just a little threshold.
Yeah, nice threshold because once again, I want to generate plenty of lactate because lactate does stimulate that mitochondrial biogenesis, and the goal for really long endurance athletes is to have more mitochondria because that way we can produce more energy aerobically. That being said, my current weightlifting split, even though I'm only getting 10 miles a week, I'm really focused on that weightlifting split. I'm doing a really high volume, probably. So I'm doing 6 days a week. So I have 3 high intensity days and then 3 high volume days. So I do my high intensity days first. So I do a squat day and some squat accessories on Monday. Tuesday I'll do deadlift and some pulling accessories. So I'll do rows, some lat pull downs, that type of stuff. Once again, I'm keeping the reps at 3 to 5, really low. And then Wednesdays I'll do a bench press day, which again is that high intensity 3 to 5 reps. And then I will move into my 3 high volume days, which is still pretty low volume to most people. I'm only doing 5 to 8 reps, not going really high, not doing sets of 15 or anything. So just 5 to 8 reps. I do that same order, so I go squat, deadlift, and pulling motions, and then bench press. I found for me personally, I like the squat, deadlift, bench, because I find that my squat has very little influence on my deadlifts.
Interesting.
But if I deadlift on Wednesday and then squat on Thursday, there's a much bigger interference from deadlifts to squats. So I can still pull sufficient weight even though I squatted the day before, whereas if I deadlift, my squats really suffer. So for me personally, that was just trial and error, kind of trying different things. I found this worked. I like it. I also really like spending time in the gym, so 6 days a week works well for me just because I enjoy it.
That's a big factor. That's huge.
I don't know if I would recommend that to everyone. It's probably not per se optimal. But for me, I enjoy it. It's optimal because I enjoy it. So it's that big caveat of consistency and sustainability. If you hate this training modality or you hate whatever split you're currently doing, chances are you're not going to be able to stick with it. And consistency is the biggest lever by far that we can pull. So while we talk about a lot about optimization, what's the best, honestly that all goes out the window if we're not consistent. Once we're consistent, that's when we can start focusing on that optimization. But if we don't enjoy it, chances are we're not going to be consistent with it, because if you dread going to the gym that 5th or 6th day, work out 4 days a week. If you can do that for years, I'd much rather you do 4 days a week for years than 5 or 6 days a week for 2 months, and you're I can't do it, I'm calling it quits. So what would you recommend for most people? Would you say that, what would be your general recommendation for our general fitness?
Yeah, I think for people who don't love being in the gym, I really like the concept of 2 full body days a week. So, and this is, guys, the more that you learn about this field, the more you realize that keeping things simple is almost always just the best way to do it, unless, of course, you want to do something different. So, literally go in, do pull-ups, bench press, squat one day, and then the other day do, deadlifts, overhead press, barbell rows. All, you don't have to stick to this. The 3 to 5 rule is pretty good for this. I do love weighted pull-ups, so you can stick to that rule on weighted pull-ups. The only one that I don't really recommend doing the 3 to 5 on would be the barbell row. just because once that gets heavy, form really starts to break down. So I would do a little bit higher reps on that. But when we're talking about like endurance athletes who want to get stronger, or even endurance athletes who want to get into concurrent training but don't want to just jump into a big strength training routine, which is a great idea. Easing into things is always a good idea. Honestly, 2 full body days, you can just do compound exercises. You're going to get results. You're going to get benefits for, 8 to 12 weeks, measurable market increases just by doing that, just by trying to progress your lifts by 5 to 10 pounds. And it doesn't even have to be that. Just over the long term, add something to something, add weight to something, add reps here or there. You do not need to measurably increase your workload in order to adapt greater. So progressive overload states basically you have to in some way with some variable make your workout harder in order to continue to adapt. Over the long run, that might be true. I would posit that is true over the long run. But on the day-to-day, week-to-week basis, trying to progress is good. But if you don't progress, it doesn't mean you're not getting better. So the extreme example of this is if you go into the gym and do 20 sets of 10 pull-ups, you're going to be fried from that pretty much no matter who you are.
It's a lot of pull-ups.
It does not mean the next time you go into the gym, you have to do 21 or 25 sets of 10 pull-ups. Obviously, this is an extreme example. What I'm getting at is all you need to do is provide the body with a sufficient stimulus to adapt. Same thing with the running. You do not have to hit 60 miles a week to get better. You have to provide, and that's an arbitrary number, obviously. All you have to do is provide enough of a stimulus to basically coerce the body into adapting. You need to just insult it just enough for it to make changes. So this is something I feel probably unnecessarily strongly about. The concept of progressive overload is it's a real thing. You do want to see that over the long term, but obsessing over adding something every single workout is, especially in this world of concurrent training, you're not going to add 5 miles a week and 5 pounds to the bar on your squat every single week for the rest of your life. You're just not going to do that. So yes, it's good to try to progress something, but don't sweat it if you're not progressing. Exercise in general is good for you, even if it's not, like for example, the whole 10 miles a week, that's low volume for us. We can handle a lot more than that, but just getting out there and running that 10 miles a week is good for you. It's still improving your cardiovascular fitness. Even though that's way under what we could theoretically handle, we are still getting benefit from that. So yeah, that's a rant. That could be a whole podcast. I feel unnecessarily strongly about progressive overload. I think I don't want to say it's overrated, it's backwards. Basically, progressive overload states that you have to add more, and we'll just use weight training, you have to add more weight in order to get stronger, when in reality, and everybody knows this, they just don't acknowledge it as much. You have to get stronger in order to progressively overload, not the other way around. So progressive overload does not make you stronger. Getting stronger allows you to progressively overload, which then, yes, allows you to get stronger. So in reality, I feel unnecessarily strong about it, but I do think helping people make that switch in their mind where, it's about the stimulus, not the exact intensity, weight, volume, whatever you're using. So yeah, I'll get that back to you. I will say we're going to have to talk about overtraining another day because we're already like an hour in.
Yeah. I completely agree with what Trey said. A lot of people get really hung up on specifically the weight portion of progressive overload. Just because that's the easiest variable to track doesn't mean it's the only variable we can progress. So a lot of times, especially with my clients and stuff, we progress different variables. So we'll stick at the same the same weight, and maybe we'll do 3 reps one week, we'll go 4 reps the next week, and then maybe let's say we're doing a squat, maybe we'll do like a tempo squat and progress it that way. So there's a lot of different variables that we can progress, and weight's just the easiest. That's what most people gravitate towards. But really, there's so many other ones that, like, we shouldn't just focus on weight. We can focus on weight, we can focus on speed and velocity. So maybe 1 week we're struggling, we're doing bench press and it takes us maybe 1.5 seconds to get back up. Maybe next week we're like, all right, let's try and get it in 1. And there's a lot of different velocity-based technology we can use that might be a little bit cost prohibitive. But at the end of the day, you can just take a video of yourself bench pressing and use your coach's eye and be like, oh, that was faster than last week. So weight, velocity, we can do reps, we can do sets, so we can do 3 sets of 3, then we can do 4 sets of 3, then 5 sets of 3, and then back it back down, do 3 sets of 4.
Yes, I love that. What you just said, that's how it's literally exactly how I got my bench from 275 to 300 in like 6 weeks. Like 25 pounds in 6 weeks for a trained athlete is, not gonna lie, that's pretty impressive. And that's exactly how I did it. Just that, I just kind of knocked progressive overload as a concept, but when done right, it can be phenomenal because you're just kind of titrating different variables in order to support. Generally, yes, weight is a great one to focus on, but there's other ways to increase the weight over the long term instead of just adding weight every time. Sorry, giving that back to you. I got excited.
You're good. And then once we go through a sufficient rep sets progression, then maybe we'll increase weight, and then we'll reset, and then we'll start back at 3 sets of 3, build our way back up, increase the weight, go back to 3 sets of 3, build our way back up. And that's what I do with a lot of my clients. We'll stick to a weight. I'll let them get really comfortable with that weight. We're doing more sets, more reps, and then all right, let's back it back down. We're going to restart this progression, increase the weight there. It's arguably a lot slower of a progress.
It works though.
But it works really well. It's, in my opinion, a little bit safer because instead of just increasing the weight and wait until we find a breaking point, we are pulling it back. We have plenty of time to adapt before we add more weight. They feel strong. They feel confident with it. And honestly, confidence is the biggest factor. And what a lot of my clients, they're not trying to be powerlifters. They're not trying to be insane endurance athletes. They're just trying to be healthier. And healthier involves not being injured. So I would much rather chase a slower, steady progression that we can always hit, that is probably slower than the rate we're adapting, in exchange for that safety and lack of injuries. Back to the training split, a lot of my clients also do 2 times a week, and I have my split very similar to the way Trace programs for his clients. I like to do an anterior versus posterior split, so it's still full body, but I'll do, on one day we'll do squats, bench press, overhead press, still all compound lifts. And then on the other day, we'll do deadlifts, maybe some barbell rows, maybe some lat pull downs. I will say the one part not that I disagree with totally, but that I've modified to allow my clients to do lower reps with the barbell row is I've modified it to a pendulum row.
Okay, yep.
So the pendulum row, the weight starts in the ground and we row it up instead of kind of isometrically holding it in the air. That allows us to still chase that strength stimulus.
Get some power in there as well.
A little bit of power. And then they're not compensating as much as a traditional barbell row with the higher intensity, lower weight, or lower reps. So that's one of the areas I've kind of gone around that. But in general, most of my clients were an hour twice a week. We're just doing all compound lifts. There's no point in isolation at that point, especially if you're just training for health and longevity. Feel good, look good, feel good, play good, as Andy Galpin says.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, let's give... So this is very much related to what we're talking about, but also kind of a sneak peek into the overtraining episode. So in terms of load management, volume load management, how do you know if you're doing enough or if you're doing too much? Whether that's just subjective feelings or objective feelings. Are you measuring progress? Do you care about progress? Do you care about just consistency? What's your kind of frame of mind, and what are your thoughts as you go through your own training and as you kind of observe your clients on their training?
So that's a great question. Once again, the biggest lever is consistency. I would rather progress really, really slow, but be consistent, than progress faster and be less consistent. So, in my training, in my clients' training, the most important variable to me is that consistency. Once I've checked off that consistency box, then I can start going into other factors. In terms of managing training load, though, there is a lot of individuality, and this is very subjective. So, a lot of times I'll ask people when they first get in, I'm like, okay, how are you feeling today? Like, how did you feel after last workout? Like, were you sore? I try to ask more open-ended questions rather than leading questions. I'm like, okay, were your quads sore? Like, were your muscles sore to the touch? Like, I try to just let them say what they're going to say, and then maybe if I need more information in a certain area, I'll ask that. But there is a lot of subjectivity, individuality, because people do respond to different levels of stimulus differently. Some people may do really well, they may really enjoy a high volume stimulus. Some people may hate that and really like that low volume, high intensity stimulus. So it really depends. Managing training load, we want the clients, athletes to recover, because if they're not recovering, we're not going to progress. So an easy way to manage the training load is to measure progression. So in general, of course there are plenty of caveats to this. If we're progressing, if we're adding reps, we're adding sets, we're adding weight, any of the variables that we previously talked about, like velocity, whatever, if those are progressing and getting better, chances are we're managing training load well. If we start to plateau for a very long time, or if we even start to decrease, like we start moving slow, we can't get all the reps that we're programmed to get, that's when we should really take a look at our training load. One of the big caveats to this too is that our bodies are kind of like a funnel for stress. So we take all this, like the stress from school, the stress from relationships, like family, training load, and our body interprets it, and our central nervous system reflects that. So just because we are maybe decreasing or plateauing, it's not like we need to completely change everything, but we need to take a holistic look. For example, I train a lot of people in the college environment. During final exams, or if they have like a really big grant due, I had a client a little while ago that had a multi-million-dollar grant he was working on. We didn't hit our numbers for a couple weeks. He was stressed. He was working on that grant all day for weeks, trying to make sure everything was perfect because he can't afford to mess it up. In that scenario, I'm not expecting to just completely blow through the water, progress really, really well because we're stressed. So a holistic approach is really good, but if you are not progressing, if you're decreasing, and there is not some sort of variable, stress, sleep, nutrition related, that's when you really need to take a look at your program and be like, okay, what is wrong here? Are we doing too much? Is the intensity too high? Is the volume too high? What do we need to modify so that we can continue to progress?
And that, I'm actually going to stop right there because that is the perfect segue into our next episode, which will be primarily on overtraining. I could, of course, address what he just said, and we could go on for forever and ever. But I'm actually going to stop it right there. I think we're actually a little bit over an hour. So thank you guys for listening. If you found this interesting, really everything today is going to be addressed in some form in the overtraining podcast that we're planning on doing next. So overtraining being too much training, but also we're going to talk about overtraining syndrome, which may or may not have something to do with how much you're training. Certainly does have a lot to do with other factors as well, like Logan alluded to, the whole funnel analogy. So yeah, we're going to actually cut it off here today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Like, subscribe, give us a good rating. Probably more important than all that, share this with somebody. Post it on your Instagram stories. Logan posts this on YouTube. If you're watching this or hearing this, you're either hearing it from me or Logan anyway. So you already know that Logan has it on Stronghold Health and Performance, and I have this on the Alterra Training Podcast on Spotify. Logan, you got any closing thoughts?
If you're listening to this on the Alterra Training Podcast on Spotify, you should head over to YouTube and subscribe to Stronghold Health and Performance. And if you're listening to it or watching it on the Stronghold Health and Performance YouTube, you should go over to Spotify and subscribe to Alterra. We're a small podcast, so the subscriptions and the comments and likes and everything do really, really help. So the more engagement we get, the more you share, you like, comment, it really does help, and it'll help us grow. So we would really appreciate it.
Yep, for sure. It really does go a long way. Plus, you'll find his other content, of course, outside the podcast. He puts a bunch out. And then I, of course, have other content as well that mostly post on Instagram. So find us through that. Thanks, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see y'all next week.